56 years ago this week, a group of men found themselves in dangerous jungle terrain. It is not an unfamiliar story of the Vietnam War, and yet this battle would forever change the lives of those who fought it, many of whom did not return home. Today we hear the stories from three who did, as they try to help us better understand the Battle of the Drang Valley. From the Vietnam Veterans Memorial Fund, founders of the Wall, this is Echoes of the Vietnam War. My name is Callie Wright, filling in as the host for Michael Crumb, bringing you stories of service, sacrifice, and healing. From people who still feel the impact of this conflict nearly 50 years later. This is episode 17, the Battle of the Drang Valley. The Vietnam Veterans Memorial is made up of more than 58,000 names, each a life cut short by the Vietnam War. The names, because they're listed chronologically, often place service members who died together in close proximity to one another. Panel 3 East has the names of those killed in the first major land battle of the Vietnam War. The names march down to reveal the more than 200 men killed in the Battle of the Drang Valley. They were part of different groups, all belonging to the 1st Cavalry Division. As of 1965, the Vietnam War had been a series of battles, and while the events of the war certainly affected service members and their families, the American people saw them as small. All of that would change when the 1st Cavalry Division came into the Drang Valley on November 14th. For 4 days, Americans and the North Vietnamese battled in 100-degree temperatures, ambushing each other at unexpected times and with deadly consequences. X-Ray and Albany would become known as the ground where the Vietnam War escalated. In the end, American service members would declare a victory, killing over 2,000 North Vietnamese soldiers. However, the win would cost the lives of over 200 Americans in battle, see many more injured, and completely change the tone of the fighting in Vietnam. This was war. The 1st Cavalry was formed in 1921 in Fort Bliss, Texas, and as their name suggests, they were known for moving around on horseback. As technological advances happened, the 1st Cavalry traded in their horses for more complex machinery, and eventually in Vietnam would become an Airmobile unit, flying Hueys, Chinooks, and other iconic aircraft throughout Southeast Asia. They were the first full division deployed to Vietnam. In 2015, 50 years from the battle, VVMF sat down with a group of them to collect their stories. Our first story comes to us from John Walanis, a soldier turned teacher who found himself face to face with a terrifying rescue mission near X-Ray.
I was in B Company, 2nd of the 7th, 2nd Battalion, 7th Cavalry, and because of the situation when we went overseas to begin with, everybody with 90 days or more who was in the Army at the time went overseas. And by the time my Drang came up in the middle of November, there were a lot of guys that were rotating home or going to rotate home. We had a lot of men in the unit that were old. The point is that the companies were very under strength. When the battalion was ordered to go into X-Ray by Colonel Moore, they were shorthanded enough that they got another company from a sister battalion, and my company commander was Myron Dederick, who was an incredible company commander. Colonel Moore said that he was the best company commander he'd ever known, including himself. So Colonel Moore liked to use B Company, and so we assaulted X-Ray with his battalion. And at the time, my company was protecting some 8-inch howitzers that were track mounted at Plainme Special Forces Camp, and we got called there to go into X-Ray, and we assaulted X-Ray late in the afternoon, 3 or 4 o'clock, and when we got there, I remember my Captain DeDerrick reporting into the anthill with Colonel Moore and finding out where we were supposed to go, and they sent the majority of the company, the line platoons, on one side of the landing zone, and they sent my platoon, the mortar platoon, to the rear, sort of the rear of the landing zone. And they took our FDC section, the Fire Direction Control section, and they consolidated that into D Company, 1st to the 7th. And I was with the 3 mortar tubes that we had set up, and by the time we got the mortar tubes set up and dug very shallow pits for them, it was dark, and I assumed, and everybody in my platoon assumed, that we had an infantry platoon or something out in front of us, and we were safely behind the lines. So I dug a shallow foxhole this deep in case we got mortared, but I wasn't expecting to fight out of it or anything. And frankly, I went to sleep. And the next morning, as it began to get light, I was waiting for it to get light enough to make some coffee. And so made some coffee, and the platoon sergeant and I were standing around looking out to our front, and the elephant grass was about chest high. We're looking out there, and we had our 3 guns placed, one to our left, one on the center, and one to the right. And we're looking over, and we could just see the tops of the mortars above the grass. And I saw a soldier about 30 yards in front of us in a khaki uniform and a pith helmet. And he was standing in front of us, and we saw him run across, and a couple other soldiers dressed like that came across. And having never seen a North Vietnamese soldier, the platoon sergeant and I looked at one another and said, who are those guys? Are those the Australians? Are they out in front of us? Right? And then we saw a light machine gun run across to our front. And when they opened up on us, we realized that they were the North Vietnamese. So no, there wasn't anybody in front of us. And the mortar platoon had a little firefight at that point. We ended up with 1 killed and 5 wounded, and that. Sergeant Buzo Alvarez from Ponce, Puerto Rico, and he was on the left. And when the shooting started early on, we had the soldiers that were with Buzo Alvarez tried to run back to where I and the platoon sergeant and his RTO were standing, and back to Sergeant Ratledge's number 1 gun, which was a little less forward than they were. And the first soldier to run back was Fred Bush, and Fred Bush got back safely, and then Jose Gonzalez came running back towards us, and he got shot by the machine gun several times, not killed, but severely wounded. And then we asked to, if there was anybody else out there, and there was just Sergeant Ratledge, and no one was sure whether or not Sergeant Ratledge was dead or alive, and the machine gun was very, very close to his mortar, so we didn't dare throw hand grenades at it because we were afraid we'd kill Sergeant Ratledge. We were debating about what to do about it, and the Sergeant Usselton's RTO's radio telephone operator, Virgie Hibbler, threw down his pack and started crawling out to Buzo Alvarez's foxhole. So I was there. I couldn't let him go by himself, so I followed Virgie's heels out to the foxhole, and we got out to the foxhole, and there was Buzo Alvarez laying on the side of the mortar pit, and he was dead. So the machine gun, it turned out, was right on the edge of the mortar pit, and we were literally almost within touching distance of it, but it didn't see us. So we crawled back, and we said, Alvarez is dead, so we can throw hand grenades. And somebody said, well, where was he wounded? And I said, well, I don't know. I didn't see a wound. So they said, well, how do you know he was dead? Crawl back out to to the mortar pit again. And at that point, the machine gun was firing, and we held a mirror under his nose. He was still dead. But we didn't want to take the chance of somebody accusing us of having him not dead again. So we dragged him back. And he was a big man. And as we started dragging him, the machine gun noticed that there was somebody there. And fortunately, our guys started shooting back. And so we managed to get back without getting shot, and shortly dispatched the machine gun with hand grenades. But that was our first KIA. It was hard for anybody to believe that, somebody was actually dead.
In 1965, then Major Bruce Crandall flew Hueys in Vietnam in incredibly dangerous situations. As a major, Crandall felt it was his duty to fly in, and he asked for a volunteer to fly with him. Captain Ed Freeman, who Crandall had known for years, volunteered. They would both go on to receive the Medal of Honor for the actions performed at Drang.
Called all of my commanders forward of my helicopters and told them what was going on, and asked for one volunteer aircraft to go with me. I never sent single aircraft or anything. Anyhow, when I asked for volunteers, Ed Freeman volunteered to go. Ed and I had been together for 10 years. I'm Uncle Bruce to his kids, and he's Uncle Ed to mine. And he wanted to go. And he wanted to lead it. Now, I'm the commander, so I explained that to him. And we took off, and I knew they needed ammo. But as a courtesy, I called Hal Moore. I said, I'm out here. I've got ammo on board. Do you want it? And, of course, he said yes. And we went in, and as we were unloading the ammo, we saw all those wounded. So we started loading wounded. And instead of going all the way back to Play Me, we went to the fire base, which was 5 miles. It was 14 half miles to Play Me. So we do 2.5 miles a minute, or 2 miles a minute. And so a 10-minute round trip gave us time to load ammo at the fire base, and we'd unload that out of one side while they're loading wounded on the other. In X-Ray. And we did that for 14 and a half hours. My award says we went in 22 times, but I went in 7 times from the other base. And so a 5-mile trip was, we went there a lot more times than 22. We don't know how many. We changed aircraft. I changed back to one of them that was shot up. They checked it out and duct taped the holes. And I flew it again because there's no fluid leaks. There's no binding. You've got to fly them. You're not a safety officer. You're not in the States. You have to fly it. And we did. The next morning I was ready to go again. To take in A Company, the 2nd and 7th, and then bring the rest of them. And the people in the landing zone got hit. So we had to delay it. I didn't know why I was being delayed. I was just told, sit. And I sat for an hour or so when I wish I had been airborne. At least not to carry in their troops, but at least to carry out their wounded. So that was the 15th. We got 2nd and 7th was closed in. The 1st to 5th came cross country in, and we continued to supply them and take out the wounded. So that was the 16th week was start to clear out of there. We had a B-52 strike scheduled. And it was the first time a B-52 raid was used in support of a unit in contact. But the requirement is you'd be 2 miles away. I don't know whose that was, but it's not a bad idea because they're bombing from a very high altitude. And the unit that moved to Albany got into it real heavy. So we lost over 300 killed in the battlefield for the operation known as the Drang. It was the heaviest losses any units had felt during that first few years in Vietnam. But it also established that the helicopters could handle it. And so the infantry always knew we'd be there. And that was the best thing that we did, was confirm the confidence of the infantry in our helicopters. We knew we'd do it. They just needed to know it too. And now it's common. We're using some of the same aircraft. The Chinooks that are in Afghanistan doing the high-level stuff were in our unit in Vietnam 50 years ago. I was doing it because it was my duty to the guys on the ground. I was responsible for them as far as I was concerned. But you learn, whether you have fear that you can't overcome. I learned that it didn't, when I got out of the aircraft, it didn't follow me. I learned that if you trusted your men, they performed. I learned that even if you don't know the people on the ground, they'll protect you, and they expect you to do the same for them. So it's a team. And when I came home, I learned how much I missed my family and how important it was to have family time, because the boys, I had 3 sons, were starting to grow up. And 12 months and 12 days later, I was back in Vietnam with the Cav. Ed Freeman got a battlefield commission in Korea on Pork Chop Hill. He was an engineer. He was my boss at one time in Panama. When I saw his name coming in, I put him in my outfit. And then I went and found him, and I told him, Ed, I would like to have you serve in my unit. He was a great friend for 55 years. He got the Medal of Honor in 2001. In the CAV, we had no way of doing awards because I was short 20 door gunners. So my clerks and cooks, and they flew as door gunners. We could do a Distinguished Flying Cross because it'd be approved at division level. Well, Ed Freeman was nominated by the infantry for the medal, and I was nominated. And I got a phone call that we were going to the same board. And I said, there's nothing wrong with that. That sounds great. He says, no, you don't understand. They're going to establish that Ed was in the 2nd helicopter and followed you all the time. So those 14 hours, he's your wingman. But he's the only one that volunteered. I'm the commander. I have to go see. So I had mine withdrawn. And I did it rather vulgarly. I called the 3-star general and told him to shove mine up his, I'm not accepting the Medal of Honor. And Freeman, I told him, I said, if Freeman doesn't get a fair shake, I'm going to come after you because you just tried something and I'll make it. And I know a lot of 4-star generals. And he got the picture because I hung up. I probably should have been a little more polite. But 7 years later, I got it. And I don't know who put me in. I don't know how that happened. I know that nobody in the aviation had anything to do with Freeman's award or my award because I wanted it to be from the infantry because that's where we were supporting them. I don't want it coming from my guys and from us because it doesn't pass the smell test. Ed got the award, and it was the best thing that ever happened to him. It brought his pride back. He lived another 5 years. The only criticism I had is he wouldn't loan it to me. Nah, you don't loan the award out, but it makes a good story.
By the end of the Vietnam War, Crandall had flown over 900 combat missions. After a short break, we will hear a story from journalist Joe Galloway about his experience during the Battle of the Drang Valley. November 11th is Veterans Day, a day our nation has declared as a celebration to honor America's veterans for their patriotism, love of country, and willingness to serve and sacrifice for the common good. Join VVMF online for a ceremony held at the Wall in Washington, D.C. We will be streaming the broadcast on our webpage or on Facebook at 1 p.m. Eastern. 2022 marks the 40th anniversary of the Vietnam Veterans Memorial, and our commemoration has already started. Every day at 3 p.m. on our website, Facebook page, and YouTube channel, we'll be reading the names of those who died on that day in the Vietnam War, which means that next week you could hear the names and see the faces of those who died in the Battle of the Drang. You can find the daily reading on our website at vvmf.org/ROTN or our Facebook page. For a lot of people, it isn't easy to visit the Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington, D.C. So VVMF created the Wall That Heals, an exact replica of the wall at 3/4 scale that travels to communities all across America. The Wall That Heals and the mobile education center that travels with it will be in Murfreesboro, Tennessee, November 11th through the 14th. This is the final stop of our 2021 season, and we look forward to announcing our 2022 schedule soon. Finally, what songs do you most associate with the Vietnam War or era? We're collecting songs and stories for a podcast episode. If you have a story to share, you can. Email us at echoes@vvmf.org or leave us a short voicemail at 1-202-330-0963. Joe Galloway, a civilian reporter working for United Press International, made it a point to spell correctly the names of those whom he interviewed in Vietnam. He knew their mothers might be reading the paper and that they might cut out that story and send it back to their sons, and so getting it right mattered. He also was passionate about telling the stories of the men and women who served in Vietnam and other conflicts.
It was Sunday, November 14th, 1965, one day past my 24th birthday. And big things were happening in the Central Highlands. I'd been up there for several weeks covering things, and there were attacks, and the 1st Cavalry Division is sending a battalion out into no man's land, an area where really no one's gone before. And we're able to do this because of the helicopter. This is going to be the event that tests whether the helicopter really is going to be the weapon of choice in Vietnam or the mode of transport. No longer would the infantry have to walk. They would fly to work. Or that was the theory anyway, and we're going to find out. And I spent that night of my birthday in a foxhole that I dug under a tea bush on a plantation where the brigade headquarters for the 3rd Brigade of the 1st Cav were located. And they were loading up a company to fly in on this operation, and they had all the Hueys lined up, and I scooted along and found a vacant seat and got in it. And here come a guy down the line. He's got a medic with him, and he's looking for a place. And he looks at me and says, "Who are you?" I said, "I'm a reporter." "Get out of there." And he puts the medic in my seat. Can't argue with that. But I was upset that I couldn't go in on the first lift, and I went to see the brigade commander, Colonel Tim Brown. Said, look, I need to get in there. And he said, look, it's probably going to be a long, hot walk in the sun and no action. But just in case, if anything happens, I'm going to go out there. I got my command helicopter, and I'll give you a ride. Well, it wasn't an hour later that something did happen, and all hell broke loose. And the colonel comes zooming out of his headquarters heading for his chopper, and I'm right behind him. So Colonel Brown flies out to the site of this battle. Not hard to find because the smoke rising off that battlefield is 5,000 feet in the air. And we circle around, and he's talking to Colonel Moore on the ground. And he wants to land, and Colonel Moore's waving him off. He says, look, this LZ is just hotter than a pistol. You land that command helicopter with all those antennae on it in here, and you're going to have to walk home. They'll shoot it to pieces. And so we're obviously not going to get to land. And just about then, an A-1E Air Force Sky Raider fighter bomber, zooms below us. And he's trailing 100 feet of fire and smoke. And they're yelling, anybody see a chute? Anybody see a chute? And it was my side of the helicopter. So I was leaning out, and I watched him all the way. And I clicked the mic and said, no chute, no chute. He rode it into the ground. And he's still there today. But we were waved off, and the colonel dumped me in a artillery fire base about 3-4 miles away. And I spent the afternoon there looking for a helicopter ride to get into the battle. And they were hard to come by. And as I spent the afternoon, 4 or 5 other reporters turned up, including my nemesis, Peter Arnett of the Associated Press. I had marched with Colonel Moore's battalion 3 days before and spent the night with them up in the hills, very cold, up on those mountain plateaus. So I spotted a captain rushing by, and I knew that it was Colonel Moore's operations officer, Captain Matt Dillon, and I grabbed him, and I said, Matt, I need a ride in. He said, I'm going in as soon as it's dark with 2 Hueys full of ammo. I said, I want a ride. And he said, I can't say yes. It's got to be the colonel. I said, get him on the radio. So I followed him into the tent, and he got Colonel Moore. I could hear the battle going on in the handset of the radio. And he reported to the colonel what he was bringing and when. And then he said, that reporter Galloway wants to come along. And the response of Colonel Moore was, I was listening very close. He said, if he's crazy enough to want to come in here and you got room, bring him. So then all I had to do was hide from the other reporters until it got near dark. And they flew back to Pleiku for a hot meal and a cold bunk and a warm shower, and I got a ride into the pages of history. The following morning, the second morning of the battle, I was sitting with my back against a little scrub oak tree, and all of a sudden, the world came apart. 2 battalions of the enemy were attacking a company-size section of our perimeter, and we were located right behind them, probably no more than 30 yards or so. And everything the enemy fired at that company that didn't hit something passed right through where we were sitting or laying, because I fell over flat on my face, flattening out as flat as I could get, because everything in the world was sailing through just about knee high. All kinds of lead. I felt a thump in my ribs, and I looked down, and it was a combat boot. And I looked up, and it was Sergeant Major Basil Plumley, a bear of a man out of West Virginia. And he bent over, and over the din of battle, which is truly deafening. You have no idea how loud war is until you're in the middle of it. And he leans over bends at the waist, and yells down in his loudest voice, "Can't take no pictures laying there on the ground, Sonny." And I thought about it and realized he was right. And I got up and I followed him, which is a smart thing to do if you're a war correspondent. Follow someone who's got stripes on his arm. You can't go too wrong that way. And especially in the case of Sergeant Major Plumley. This was his third war. He had done World War II. He made all 4 combat jumps of the 82nd Airborne, Sicily, Salerno, Normandy, and Holland, and 1 combat jump in Korea. And here he was on his third war. And he knew that we were in some dire danger of being overrun. And he was gathering up what kind of a battalion reserve he could, including 1 reporter. And he went over to the battalion surgeon and the medical platoon sergeant, Sergeant Keaton. And he pulled out his .45 and he jacked around into the thing and he hollered at them, "Gentlemen, prepare to defend yourselves." And the doc looked like he had been shot. I mean, he'd been drafted out of his residency, and he was an honorary captain, is what it really is. And he certainly didn't expect he was going to have to use that .45 he was carrying. Plumley was doing what he felt he should do. And as this battle progressed, Hollywood has the sergeant major giving me an M16. It didn't happen that way. I brought my own. I carried an M16 and a lot of loaded magazines in my pack. There are some events that are so horrific and so immediate that you cannot be a neutral observer. You can't be the civilian non-combatant who stands apart from this thing. These are people who are laying down their lives so that you might live, and you owe them something too. And I carried water, I carried the wounded, and I eventually picked up the M16 and did what I had to do. Because you can have the greatest story in the world. If you don't live to tell it, it dies with you. So I did what I had to do, and I make no bones about it. That was my first tour in Vietnam. I went on to do 3 more, and I went on to cover Americans at war for 43 years. I never saw again any battle so immediate, so violent, so bloody. In a matter of 4 days and nights, 234 young Americans were killed. And the truth is, not a single one of us left that place the same man who arrived there. It changed us all. It changed our lives. For me, 80 young Americans had laid down their lives so that I might live to tell their story. And I knew that I owed them, and really all soldiers and Marines, a sacred obligation to tell their stories. That's a heavy burden, but one that I bear proudly, and I have spent my life since those days, 50 years now, half a century, trying to fulfill that obligation.
On August 18th, 2021, Joe Galloway passed away. Our CEO and president, Jim Knotts, had this to say.
Joe was an author, award-winning newspaper correspondent, and civilian reporter during the Vietnam War. Joe was awarded the Bronze Star Medal for helping rescue wounded soldiers during the Battle of the Drang Valley in November 1965. This battle was depicted in the movie We Were Soldiers, starring Mel Gibson. But Joe spent his career with the troops during multiple wars, always telling the story of the war from the soldier's perspective. Most of all, in our experience, Joe was an outspoken, irascible, and usually unfiltered advocate for Vietnam veterans. We will miss his voice, his unique perspective, and his kindness to our troops.
The Battle of the Drang Valley cannot be told in one story or even three. It is hundreds of perspectives, hundreds of young men who did not come home, and many others who did, and try to help us all better understand what happened. Due to the incredible heroism of many of those who fought in the Battle of the Drang Valley, the 1st Cavalry became the first unit in Vietnam to receive the Presidential Unit Citation. Thanks for checking out the official podcast from the founders of The Wall in Washington, D.C. We publish a new episode every 2 weeks, so be sure to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. And if you like it, there are a couple of easy things you can do to help support it. One is to share it with a friend who might like it as well. Another thing that helps us out tremendously is if you leave us a rating or a review wherever you get your podcasts. You'd be surprised how much that little action helps new listeners find us.